Good evening. It's our honor to have Professor John K. Roth with us this evening to discuss and engage us with the topic of ethics during and after the Holocaust. Dr. Roth is the Edward J. Sexton Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights, now the Center for Human Rights, at Claremont McKenna College, where he taught from 1966 through 2006. In 2007-08, he served as the Robert and Carolyn Frederick Distinguished Visiting Professor of Ethics at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana. In addition to service on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council and on the editorial board for the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies, he has published hundreds of articles and reviews and co-authored, or edited more than 50 books, including Approaches to Auschwitz, Ethics During and After the Holocaust, the Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, and Rape, Weapon of War and Genocide. He's currently working on 3 more books. He was explaining earlier, kind of informally, that he is retired. Roth has been visiting professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Haifa, Israel, and his Holocaust-related research appointments have included a Kerner Visiting Fellowship at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies in England, as well as an appointment at the Ina Levine Invitational Scholar at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. From 2011 to 2013, he chaired the National Board of the Federation of State Humanities Councils. Roth was named the 1988 U.S. National Professor of the Year by the Council for Advancement and Support of Education and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And in 2012, he received the Holocaust Educational Foundation's Distinguished Achievement Award for Holocaust Studies and Research. This is abbreviated. What I just read is abbreviated. I'll not importune you with further prefatory remarks other than to say that we are very much going to value Professor Roth's time here with us, and I think we'll find his remarks of immense assistance to us as we consider Holocaust and genocide studies at Western Washington University. So, Professor Roth, thank you very much for your assistance and for spending time with us. So with that, I will just invite you to begin. Dr. Roth.
Thank you, Provost Carbajal, for your warm welcome. And I want to express immense gratitude to Professor Sandra Alfers for her hospitality and organization and invitation to be at Western Washington University in Bellingham this week. It's a great privilege and an honor to be with you. Retirement for an academic person really means an extended sabbatical, so long as your wits and health are more or less intact, as I hope mine still are. You'll be the judge of that after the evening progresses a bit. 100 years ago tonight, World War I was raging in Europe, and plans were laid for an invasion at a place called Gallipoli. And around the same time, an event that we now know as the Armenian Genocide was launched. The 100th anniversary of that atrocity will be celebrated by the Armenian community, I believe, on April 24th. Less than 25 years after 1915, the Second World War was underway, and 70 years ago tonight, the world was about at the point where the German city of Dresden had been firebombed, where in a matter of weeks Adolf Hitler would take his own life, and where the Holocaust would finally come to a sort of ending, except that these mass atrocity crimes don't ever really end. They continue. As William Faulkner liked to say, the past is not over. In fact, it's not even the past. It's the present still. So with those historical benchmarks as part of the context, I want to begin our reflections on ethics during and after the Holocaust tonight with two kind of governing quotations and then two episodes from that history that I'll describe. The first quotation comes from one of the books by Primo Levi, a survivor of Auschwitz, one of the great writers about the Holocaust, who says of his friend Lorenzo, whom I'll mention in more detail in a moment, that Lorenzo said to Primo Levi, "We are in the world to do good. We are in the world to do good." And then a statement from another survivor of Auschwitz, Elie Wiesel, who said at one point something that I've remembered and thought about a great deal. The Holocaust, said Wiesel, demands interrogation and calls everything into question. Traditional ideas and acquired values, he said, philosophical systems and social theories, all must be revised in the shadow of Birkenau. Now, just a word about how I understand the idea or the concept of ethics. Defined by the intention to encourage human action that fits sound understanding about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, good and evil, virtuous and corrupt, ethics, I think, is arguably civilization's keystone. At its best, ethics emphasizes careful deliberation about the difference between right and wrong, encouragement not to be indifferent about that difference, cultivation of virtuous character, and action that defends what is right and resists what is wrong. So with that understanding of ethics, helping to form the context for thinking about ethics during and after the Holocaust, consider now two episodes from the history of that catastrophe. In his book called Moments of Reprieve, the Italian Jew and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi recalled his friend Lorenzo Perrone, the person Levi credited with saving his life in Auschwitz. Not a Jew, but an Italian civilian, Lorenzo, a skilled mason, was officially a voluntary worker helping to build the industrial plant that the Germans were constructing at a place known as Auschwitz III. Established in 1942, this subcamp in the vast Auschwitz complex, also called Buna or Monowitz, housed prisoners. Elie Wiesel, as well as Levi, were among them, who toiled at the synthetic rubber factory located on the outskirts of the Polish village of Monowice. In fact, however, Lorenzo was more like a labor conscript, and he despised the German cruelty that he saw at Auschwitz. After meeting Levi in late June of 1944, Lorenzo decided to help his fellow Italian, although it was a crime with grave consequences for Lorenzo even to speak to an Auschwitz prisoner. For months, Lorenzo got Levi extra food, which was the physical difference between life and death. I believe that it was really due to Lorenzo that I am alive today, Levi would write, underscoring that Lorenzo's help meant much more than food alone. What also sustained him was that Lorenzo, as Levy put it, constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror. Something difficult to define, said Levy, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. When liberation came, Levy lost track of Lorenzo, but later he became determined to find out what had happened to his life-saving friend. They reconnected for a short time in Italy after the war, but soon Lorenzo died. At one of their post-war meetings, Levy learned that he was not the only Auschwitz prisoner whom Lorenzo had helped. But Levy's friend had rarely told that story. In Lorenzo's view, wrote Levy, we are in the world to do good, not to boast about it. Turning to the second episode, just a few weeks before Levy met Lorenzo Perrone, Elie Wiesel and his family were among the Jews deported from Siget, Wiesel's hometown in Nazi-occupied Hungary. In his classic memoir called Night, Wiesel describes the railroad ordeal that reduced his world to what he called a cattle car hermetically sealed. Wiesel recalls the heat, the thirst, the pestilential stench, the suffocating lack of air, but emphasizes that they were as nothing compared with the screams that tore us to shreds. The screams, Wiesel says, were those of a middle-aged woman whom he identifies only as Madame Schechter, although he adds that he knew her well. She was imprisoned in the cattle car with her 10-year-old son, but her husband and 2 older boys had been deported earlier. The separation, says Wiesel, had completely broken her. Madame Schechter had gone out of her mind. Her disorientation was revealed not only by moans and increasingly hysterical screams, Wiesel tells us, but also by the visions that provoked them. Madame Schechter could not see outside the train car, but on the 3rd night of the seemingly endless journey, she saw flames in the darkness. "Listen, listen to me," she kept exclaiming. "I can see a fire. There are huge flames. It's a furnace." At first, the screams led some of the men to look through the small openings that allowed a little air into their cattle car prison, but they saw no flames. There was nothing there, reports Wiesel, only the darkness. Some took pity and tried to calm Madame Schechter. Others were less kind. Wanting her quiet, they bound, gagged, and even struck her. Blows, Wiesel acknowledges, that might have killed her. Meanwhile, he observes, her little boy clung to her. He did not cry out. He did not say a word. He was not even weeping now. Dawn's arrival stilled the bewildered woman. She remained quiet throughout the next day, but the 4th night again brought her screaming visions of fire. On the following day, the train stopped at a station. None of Madame Schechter's flames were to be seen, but signs indicated that the train had reached Auschwitz. No one, says Wiesel, had ever heard that name. For an afternoon and on into the evening, the train did not move, but with nightfall, Madame Schechter's mad cries were again renewed. At last, the train began to move, and as it took the rail spur that had been recently constructed to facilitate the arrival of transports at Birkenau, the killing center at Auschwitz, Madame Schechter once more became quiet. But other voices echoed hers with terrible screams of their own. They accurately reported what now could be clearly seen. Look through the window, flames, look. lighting up the darkness as they reached skyward from Birkenau's crematorium furnaces. These flames turned Jewish lives into smoke and ash. With the transport's arrival at Birkenau, the cattle cars opened and the prisoners were rousted toward the selection process that determined their fate, a gas chamber murder or the slave labor that eventually resulted in death for most of those who were chosen. The selection process began. It spared Wiesel and his father Shlomo, but condemned his mother Sarah and his little sister Zipporah. Night, Wiesel's memoir, also indicates that Wiesel caught one last glimpse of Madame Schechter and the little boy who held her hand. Madame Schechter and her son were of no use to the Germans at Auschwitz. Birkenau's furnaces soon consumed them. As for Wiesel and his father, their Auschwitz path took them toward a fiery pit in which little children were being burned. Wiesel recalls his father's words. Do you remember, his father Shlomo said, do you remember Madame Schechter in the train? The immediate response in Night does not contain an explicit answer to his father's questions, but the words that follow are among Wiesel's most powerful. Some of you will know this passage from his memoir, I think. Never shall I forget that night, Wiesel writes, the first night in camp which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. Initially studying Wiesel's Night, his memoir, more than 40 years ago, I became a philosopher tripped up by Holocaust history. In my early 30s at the time, my American life was progressing well, and despite the fact that my philosophical interests focused on questions about injustice, suffering, and evil, the Holocaust was not at the center of my attention. The experiences that Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi reported were distant from my experience, to say the least. Nevertheless, what had happened to Levi, to Madame Schechter and her son, to Wiesel and his family, had taken place during my lifetime. My life, their lives, indeed all of our lives, are realities of one world, and the resulting collisions of consciousness and concern would drive me to find out as much as I could about how and why the Holocaust happened. My study convinced me that Wiesel was correct when he went on to say that the Holocaust demands interrogation and calls everything into question. Traditional ideas and acquired values, as he put it, philosophical systems and social theories, all must be revised in the shadow of Birkenau. Those words, along with others that Wiesel has written, indicate that his memory of Madame Schechter has never left him. Decades after writing Night, Wiesel recalled her in his later memoir, published in 1995, called All Rivers Run to the Sea. Certain images of the days and nights spent on that train invade my dreams even now, Wiesel wrote. Anticipation of danger, fear of the dark, the screams of poor Mrs. Schechter, who in her delirium saw flames in the distance, the efforts to make her stop, the terror in her little boy's eyes. Such recollections have made Wiesel wonder, And here I quote him, "And what of human ideals, or of the beauty of innocence, or the weight of justice? Why all these deaths?" Questions shape the Holocaust's legacy. As the episodes from Levy and Wiesel suggest, what happened to ethics during and after the Holocaust looms large among them. Especially in his book called The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi explored what he called the gray zone. As Levi experienced and explored that Auschwitz region, he stressed that it contained surprises and shocks that revealed a world that was not only terrible, as he put it, but also indecipherable. It did not conform to any model. Levi did not mince words about the fact that the Holocaust epitomized wrongdoing, and never more so in his judgment than when the Germans created what were called the Sonderkommando, those units of predominantly Jewish prisoners whose task it was to man the Auschwitz crematoria. Conceiving and organizing those squads, said Levi, was National Socialism's most demonic crime. Those clear and distinct moral judgments, however, mixed and mingled with two other dimensions of awareness that made Levi a much more complicated and profound ethical thinker. First, Levi saw that gray-zoned behavior could not be neatly analyzed in terms of right and wrong, at least not as most ethical traditions might try to do. Arguably, those traditions could still be used to judge the National Socialist perpetrators of the Holocaust, but their relevance was less clear for judging those who were conscripted into the Sonderkommando, let alone for determining what those hapless men should do, condemned as they were to a fate of choiceless choices before they too were murdered. Next, Levi saw how the gray zone revealed a tragic dysfunctionality for ethics. That dysfunctionality had at least two parts. First, traces of idealism about treating one's neighbor as oneself or of refusing to steal might remain in the gray zone, but within that region of experience, such teachings lost their appeal. As Levi put the point, the physiological reserves of the organism were consumed in 2 or 3 months, and death by hunger or by diseases induced by hunger was the prisoner's normal destiny, avoidable only with additional food. Obtaining that extra nourishment, he went on to say, required a privilege, large or small, granted or conquered, astute or violent, licit or illicit, whatever it took to lift oneself above the norm. Second, if the most basic ethical teachings lost their appeal in the gray zone, then that fact scarcely inspired confidence, then or now, that the world has a fundamental moral structure that can be trusted. True, Levi thought that at least sometimes, as he said, at least in part, historical crimes are punished, and he believed that the Nazi project had been suicidal. But Levi's book, The Drowned and the Saved, was written overall in a minor key, and its chapter on the gray zone ends as follows. Willingly or not, wrote Levi, we come to terms with power, forgetting that we are all in the ghetto, that the ghetto is walled in, that outside the ghetto reign the lords of death, and that close by the train is waiting. Levi knew that a kind of logic governed Nazi thinking. He did not unpack, however, something implied by his insight, something that others have underscored in ways that not only are consistent with Levi's outlook, but also create additional worries about and for ethics, especially after the Holocaust. In 1988, for example, the scholar Peter Haas identified what he called the Nazi ethic. 15 years later, the historian Claudia Kuhns wrote a book about the Nazi conscience. That concept, she joined Haas to show, is not an oxymoron. On the contrary, Kuhns argued persuasively, the popularizers of anti-Semitism and the planners of genocide followed a coherent set of severe ethical maxims derived from broad philosophical concepts. Both Haas and Kuhns helped to show that ethical reasoning can take multiple forms which can be at lethal odds with one another. Kuhns made that point by referring to the German political theorist Carl Schmitt, who rejected universal human rights and argued in May 1933 that not every being with a human face is human. It's a chilling idea. Not every being, Schmitt said, with a human face is human. One can and must argue that such reasoning is false and wrong, but arguments do not guarantee the triumph of rationality, especially when what counts as rational is not only arguable, but also a factor in struggles for power and political control. No one can take much comfort from saying, after its devastation was wreaked, that the Holocaust was wrong. The Holocaust signifies an immense human failure. It did enormous harm to ethics by showing how ethical teachings could be overridden, rendered dysfunctional, or even subverted to serve the interests of genocide. That outcome created an ongoing dilemma. Another Holocaust survivor, the philosopher Sarah Kaufman, identified this dilemma in a gut-level way. How is it possible to speak, she wrote in her memoir called Smothered Words, how is it possible to speak when you feel a strange double bind, an infinite claim to speak, a duty to speak infinitely, imposing itself with irrepressible force, and at the same time, an almost physical impossibility to speak, a choking feeling? The Holocaust can create a duty to speak, an obligation to make ethics stronger and less subject to overriding dysfunctionality or subversion, an insistence not only to drive home the difference between right and wrong, but also to influence action accordingly. Yet such an obligation can also produce a choking feeling, a sense that too much harm has been done for a good recovery to be made, a suspicion that ethics may be overwhelmed by the challenges it faces. The bind is double, for the sense of ethical responsibility, real though it is, remains hopelessly optimistic and naive unless it grapples with the despair that encounters with the Holocaust are bound to produce. To be touched by that despair, however, scarcely encourages one to believe that ethical responsibilities will be accepted and met. Caught between the post-Holocaust need to speak for ethics, and above all to speak ethically and boldly on the one hand, and the feeling that the key elements of ethics, words, arguments, appeals to reason, persuasion through the example of moral action, that those things may be inadequate, on the other hand, the question persists, given what happened to ethics during the Holocaust, what can and should be made of ethics after Auschwitz? The Holocaust produced what Sarah Kaufman called knotted words, like words knotted up, especially for survivors of that genocide. Such words, she suggested, are demanded and yet forbidden because for too long they have been internalized and withheld. Knotted words, she went on to say, stick in your throat and cause you to suffocate, to lose your breath. They asphyxiate you, she said, taking away the possibility of even beginning. Kaufman understood all too well what she was saying, for like some other important writers who survived the Holocaust, Primo Levi probably among them, she eventually took her own life. Born in 1934, Sarah Kaufman was not yet 8 years old when her father was caught in the roundup of some 13,000 Parisian Jews that took place on the 16th and 17th of July, 1942. She survived as a hidden child, but she never saw her father again. Her father's death suffocated Kaufman, stifled her words. It did so, however, not simply because it was her father's death, grievous enough though a father's death can be for anyone, but it was also because, as she put it, he was a Jew, that my father died in Auschwitz. Kaufman's emphasis on smothered words, moreover, shows that her choking feeling was inseparable from the memory of how her father died in Auschwitz. My father, a rabbi, she writes, was killed because he tried to observe the Sabbath in the death camps, buried alive with a shovel for having, or so the witnesses reported, refused to work on that day in order to celebrate the Sabbath, to pray to God for them all, victims and executioners, reestablishing in this situation of extreme powerlessness and violence a relation beyond all power. And they could not bear, writes Kaufman, that a Jew, that vermin, even in the camps, did not lose faith in God. Because he was a Jew, said Kaufman, my father died in Auschwitz. Not just a father's death, but a particular Jewish father's death in its Auschwitz specificity. That event, which Kaufman calls my absolute, made the suffocating difference. All she had left of her father, Kaufman observed, was his fountain pen. Patched up with Scotch tape, it could produce words no more. But right in front of me on my desk, she says, that mute pen makes me write. As she thought about the idea of humanity after the Holocaust, for example, she saw that the value of a shared sense of humanity, of our belonging to a human species, depends on whether that belonging binds us together in mutual respect and caring, whether it draws people together in community. As Kaufman sized up the situation, however, the connections between the unity implied by the word humanity and the senses of community that may or may not follow are tenuous and even problematic. First, she pointed out, no community is possible with the SS. I think today we might look at her statement and ask whether any community is possible with ISIS. But she put it in her historical context that she thought no community was possible with the SS because with a vengeance, Nazi ideology rejected the idea of an inclusively shared humanity, regarding difference, especially alleged racial difference, as profoundly threatening. Its genocidal impulses led to mass murder and to Auschwitz. Nazi Germany, of course, took pride in its own sense of community, which underscores that community is not necessarily humanity's ally, especially if humanity is understood to be pluralistic and diverse. So Kaufman made a second point. It is crucial, she said, to support the community of those without community. Those without community are outsiders, but Kaufman's thinking did not stop with a call to defend and protect those who are threatened and harmed by others because they are left out. More radically and fundamentally, she rejected all senses of community that are based on what she called any specific difference or on a shared essence. The right forms of community, she seems to be saying, are those that consciously accept a double bind. This bind acknowledges that every community is particular, different, finite, even exclusive in one way or another, but no community should rest on assumptions about immutable superiority or inferiority. On the contrary, the particularity of one community ought to affirm, protect, and encourage the particularity of others. Here, Kaufman's words are not smothered or nodded, but they remain less than fully expressed. They remain hints, allusions, or signposts pointing to an ethical outlook that would not be the same as old outlooks that appealed to human nature, to the essence of humanity, or to reason as humankind's most decisive characteristic. Instead, she suggests everyday realities and actions, such things as choices in keeping or betraying one's word, reveal our humanity and make all the difference. The Holocaust reaffirmed that all of those caught in it, perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and more, were human. In some sense, humanity survived the Holocaust. But if humanity is to mean more than that, if humanity is to be what Kaufman thought it ought to become, then what she called a new kind of we must be envisioned and enacted. A new humanism, one might say in her words, as if it were still acceptable to use this trite and idyllic word. What about Sarah Kaufman's guarded hope? She glimpsed and emphasized the possibility of a new humanism and a new ethics. But the Holocaust scholar Raoul Hilberg seemed to stress a different theme, even one that disagreed with hers, when he spoke at a conference on ethics after the Holocaust at the University of Oregon a few years ago. Explaining that he did not consider himself a philosopher or a theologian, Hilberg, one of the truly great scholars of the Holocaust, asserted that ethics is the same today as it was yesterday, and even the day before yesterday, as he liked to put it. It is the same after Auschwitz as it was before and during the lethal options and operations at that place. Especially with regard to needless and wanton killing, Hilberg emphasized, ethics is the same for everyone, everywhere. He left no unclarity. Such killing is wrong. We know that, he said, in our bones. For such knowledge, he believed, is the heritage of many years. Sarah Kaufman, I think, would accept Hilberg's claims only up to a point before conceding that Hilberg's bold pronouncement unknots some of the words that ethics after Auschwitz needs to express. Senses of right and wrong are real. The Holocaust helps to focus them. Even the SS leader Heinrich Himmler knew as much. He and the other perpetrators of the Holocaust were aware of the psychological turmoil created by their orders to kill. And they did their best to make those tasks easier, more humane, by distancing the killers from their victims. Thus, Himmler and his henchmen substituted mass gassings for mass shootings. But did Himmler and the other perpetrators know in their bones, to use Raoul Hilberg's phrase, did they know in their bones that what they were doing was wrong? In some cases, there is evidence that says so. The perpetrators covered their tracks as best they could. Many of the killers numbed themselves with alcohol. Some Germans refused orders to kill, especially when children were the targets. On the other hand, such evidence is mostly circumstantial. It was not very often enhanced by admissions of guilt or expressions of remorse. Far more common were excuses that referred to orders that must be obeyed or to fears of punishment if obedience was not forthcoming. For the most part, Nazi leaders and Holocaust perpetrators remained unrepentant. At the end of the day, their behavior does not show that they knew that their killing of the Jews was wanton, needless, and wrong. On the contrary, their behavior suggests that they believe their killing to be necessary, right, and even good, although extremely difficult and even loathsome to do. It would be comforting if Raoul Hilberg's convictions were true, but the Holocaust does not inspire confidence that all human beings know, in their bones or in any other way, that mass killing and genocide are wrong. Sarah Kaufman, I think, was right. No community was possible with the SS because the SS did not think the destruction of the European Jews was wrong. To see such action as wrong, as Kaufman also understood, depended on an entirely different approach to choosing and fidelity than Nazism required. To the extent that moral sensitivity complicated the killing that the perpetrators carried out month after month and year after year, those ethical impulses did have to be overridden. Himmler and his henchmen could rely on an ally of vast authority, namely human consciousness itself. Humanity's capacity to think is amazingly pliable, especially so in its ability to justify whatever the powers that be want done. The explanations offered by German industrialists to warrant their use of slave labor. For example, Germany was fighting for its life. What else could one do? Were only one strand in a web of rationalization and repression that did much to ensure that dissenting moral scruples would be subordinated to higher necessities, or even that the dictates of morality and mass murder would coincide. The Nazis were not totally successful in this regard, but when one remembers that the persons responsible for the Holocaust were a cross-section from virtually every profession, skill, and social class, then the persistence with which the final solution went forward without effective moral dissent is the more striking. Absent the force of will, nothing guarantees that ethics will not be smothered after the Holocaust, as it was with such devastating results during that disaster. If one wants to affirm the United Nations Declaration that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, one must realize, I think, that such claims are as frail as they are abstract. Rights, liberty, and security of person are real only in specific times and places, only in actual political circumstances. Apart from such concrete settings, those ideals are only that. Granted, they are ideals that can attract, they can bring out the best in people, they can rally powerful forces behind them, they may even have a transcendent status ordained by God. To assume, however, that they are any more than ideals until men and women take responsibility to make them a concrete reality may well be an illusion. In our pluralistic world, in which cultural, religious, and philosophical perspectives vary considerably, a widely held belief is that values are so relative to one's time and place that the truth of moral claims is much more a result of subjective preference and political power than a function of objective reality and universal reason. That relativistic outlook meets resistance in the Holocaust, however, for there is a widely shared conviction that the Holocaust was wrong. It was something that should not have happened, and nothing akin to it should ever happen again. Michael Berenbaum puts the point effectively when he emphasizes that the Holocaust has become what he calls a negative absolute. Even if people remain skeptical that rational agreement can be obtained about what is right, just, and good, the Holocaust seems to reestablish conviction that what happened at Auschwitz and Treblinka and other places of mass murder was wrong, unjust, and evil, period. Unfortunately, to identify the Holocaust as a negative absolute that reinstates confidence in moral absolutes is a step, as the gray zone reminds us, that cannot be taken easily. To reiterate an earlier point, the Holocaust signifies an immense human failure. It did harm to ethics by showing how ethical teachings could be overridden, rendered dysfunctional, or even subverted to serve the interests of genocide. When Michael Berenbaum calls the Holocaust a negative absolute, the absoluteness involved means that not even ethics itself was immune from failure and at times complicity in the pathological conditions and characteristics that nearly destroyed Jewish life and left the world morally scarred forever. The gray-zoned status of ethics after the Holocaust is far from settled. One might argue that Nazi Germany's defeat shows that right defeated wrong and that goodness subdued evil, and that there is a right side of history, thus showing that reality has a fundamentally moral underpinning. The Holocaust, however, I think, is far too awesome for such easy triumphalism. The Nazis did not win, but they came too close for comfort. Even though the Third Reich was destroyed, it is not so easy to say that its defeat was a clear and decisive triumph for goodness, truth, and justice over evil, falsehood, and corruption. Add to those realizations the fact, as we've noted, that the Nazis themselves, in a sense, were idealists. They had positive beliefs about right and wrong, good and evil, duty and responsibility. The final solution was a key part of the Nazi ethic, perhaps the essence of its practice, which took place with a zealous, even apocalyptic vengeance. It would be too convenient to assume that the Nazi ethic's characteristic blending of loyalty, faith, heroism, and even love for country and cause was simply a passive, mindless obedience. Most people are unlikely to serve a cause unto death unless that cause makes convincing moral appeals about what is good and worthy of loyalty. Those appeals, of course, can be blind, false, or even sinful, and the Nazis were. Nevertheless, the perceived and persuasive goodness of the beliefs that constituted the Nazi ethic, the dedicated SS man embodied them most thoroughly, is essential to acknowledge if we are to understand why so many Germans willfully followed Hitler into genocidal warfare. As Sarah Kaufman helped to show, our senses of moral and religious authority have been weakened by the accumulated ruins of history and the depersonalized advances of civilization that have taken us from a bloody 20th century into what may become an even more problematic 21st century. A moral spirit, a religious commitment, and a political determination that have the courage to persist in spite of humankind's self-inflicted destructiveness are essential. But the question remains how effective those dispositions can be in a world where power, and especially the power of governments, stands at the heart of that matter. To find ways to affect the powers that be so that their tendencies to lay waste to human life are checked, ethics after the Holocaust needs to draw on every resource it can find. Appeals to human rights, calls for renewed religious sensitivity, respect and honor for people who save lives and resist tyranny, and attention to the Holocaust warnings, to name only a few. Those efforts will need to be accompanied by efforts that build those concerns into our educational, religious, business, and civic institutions. Sarah Kaufman never forgot what the Nazi assault meant, namely that after July 16, 1942, she never saw her father, Barak Kaufman, again. Nazism and the Holocaust were an assault on the values that human beings hold most dear when we are at our best. Resistance to protect them came too late then, hence resistance continues to be urgent now, and it begins perpetually with small deeds, the raising of critical questions among them. Sarah Kaufman, Her smothered words, the Holocaust double binds, each and all her hard-earned perspectives underscore that nothing human, natural, or divine guarantees respect for those values. Nothing, though, is more important than our commitment to defend them, for they remain as fundamental as they are fragile, as precious as they are endangered. As a postscript, remember Primo Levi's friend Lorenzo, who Levi said constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural and plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror, something difficult to define, a remote possibility of good, but for which it was worth surviving. Lorenzo's actions and Levi's testimony about them bear witness to insights that can make an immense difference if they are heeded. Levi may have been right in thinking, as he did, that no universal human conscience exists, that there is no innate and shared moral compass to guide us if only we would pay attention and follow it. But that sensibility does not negate, at least not completely, the reminding presence of Lorenzo, which testifies that we are in this world to do good. Remote though it often seems, difficult to define though it may be, that possibility remains. More than that, the possibility becomes an imperative if the world is to be less corrupt and savage and more opposed to hatred and terror. Levi was right, I think, to suggest that it is difficult to define precisely how it is that we are in this world to do good. But it was not difficult for Levi to feel Lorenzo's presence and to discern Lorenzo's natural and plain manner of being good. Those characteristics were oppression-resisting, hope-sustaining, death-defying, and life-giving. More often than not, ethics at its best involves reminders of the kind embodied and embedded in Lorenzo's actions. Reminders are not always welcome or followed, but good reminders of the kind that Lorenzo gave Levi are testimonies about sometimes difficult to define realities, justice, compassion, respect, love, that have been experienced, at least at times, in word and deed. Reminders about those realities may be especially acute when such qualities are threatened and in short supply. But Levi testified with insistence that Lorenzo's reminder, we are in this world to do good, should always be vivid and never abandoned. About as far from Auschwitz as I can get, at least, the town of Winthrop is where I now make my home. It sits small, as some of you know, in the Methow Valley, a place of spectacular beauty on the eastern slope of the majestic Cascade Range, almost as far north as Bellingham. As I think about what has happened to ethics during and after the Holocaust, my thoughts often include the poetry of William Stafford, one of our national treasures. Stafford's poems focus on the natural world, often on our abuse of it. They're also drenched in history. His verse laments the carnage we human beings inflict and encourages resistance against it. Although the Holocaust was not Stafford's theme, he knew plenty about war and genocide. In works such as "The Darkness Around Us is Deep," he wondered, as Wiesel did in "Night," whether ultimately only the darkness was there. Stafford's poem called "Meditation," for example, goes as follows. Animals full of light walk through the forest toward someone aiming a gun loaded with darkness. That's the world, God holding still, letting it happen again and again and again. As I understand that very brief poem, Stafford's words do not express resignation and despair. They voice protest and the possibility of creative change instead. More than 20 years ago, two Methow Valley forest rangers, Curtis Edwards and Sheila McLean, contacted William Stafford and made an unusual request. Would he help them create what they called poetry road signs for the North Cascades Highway and its surroundings? Stafford agreed, and the result was a brilliant set that came to be called the Methow River Poems. Some of those poems appeared on the signs that can still be found here and there in the Methow Valley. I am particularly fond of one of Stafford's Methow River poems called "Being a Person." It invites a reader or viewer to contemplate the Methow River as its clear, cold water rushes to the Columbia and then to the Pacific. Its reflections make a good ending and beginning for any stock taking, but especially one that asks how we should respond to what happened to ethics during the Holocaust and what we should make of ethics in the shadow of Birkenau. Be a person here, writes Stafford. How you stand here is important. How you listen for the next thing to happen. How you breathe. Whatever else it may be, ethics after the Holocaust is about those things. What we hear as we listen for what is happening, how we breathe, how we stand. Nothing could be more important. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm told if you have the interest and energy for some give and take, some questions and answers or comments, we can do that. But you need to raise a hand if you'd like to speak, since we're recording this for television, and a microphone can come your way so you can be heard and be part of the recording.
Professor Ross, I wanted to thank you, thank you for coming and speaking to us today. And I very much enjoyed your talk. I have two questions. You did give a brief mention to kind of questions of historical contingency. So you'll have to excuse me, this question comes from a historian. Mm-hmm. I was curious if you think that ethics are universal.
Okay.
You make a lot of references, or you made a lot of references in your talk to ethics before the Holocaust and ethics afterwards. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that I understand exactly how ethics have changed, and if it is really kind of morality that informs ethics, or what is it exactly?
Okay, let me begin by addressing the first part of your question about whether ethics are universal, by which I would understand, is there something that all of us as human beings share in common about understanding what's right and what's wrong, what's good, what's evil? Primo Levi said that the longer he lived, the more skeptical he became about that kind of proposition. And I'm kind of with him on that. But I think the goal ought to be to move in the direction of a universal, a shared understanding of values. We're not anywhere close to being there, but it's something to strive for. And this is where I would see the value of Michael Berenbaum's suggesting that the Holocaust might be an instance of what he calls a negative absolute. That there may be senses of understanding that are more likely to form, maybe a little easier to come by with regard to seeing what it is that is wrong. And that might be an important basis for moving in a direction of a better shared understanding of what is good and right. But I think this is something that has to be worked at. It isn't something that we can assume to be innate or that we're born with or that we just have by virtue of being human some way. I think that's all too convenient and too easy in light of what history has shown us and what the study of cultures has revealed to us. So it's in that sense, I think that Sarah Kaufman was onto something when she said, we need a different kind of understanding of the ethical than has been customary. Where Hilberg was right in saying ethics is the same today as it was yesterday and the day before yesterday is that the thing we need to strive for is a shared understanding about, what is wrong and what is good and what justice might involve. So that would be a start, at least, on your good and difficult question and comment.
I wonder if ethics serves a purpose before tragedy, that is to give people the belief that they are safe and that there is a common culture, a common value, and that allows us to function up to the point where the system collapses. And the very same people that might be prosecuting for ethical violations today will be committing them tomorrow. Mm-hmm. The fall of the collapse of the Second International on the question of war and peace.
Yes.
They certainly knew what was right and what was wrong, and yet all those parties worldwide, most of them all collapsed on that issue. And I wonder if one of the, for example, Nazi Germany's war objectives was to strip away that illusion of inner peace and peaceful community, peaceful civilization, in order to terrorize people even before the war started, before they crossed over into Poland and so on.
Yes. Thank you for those comments. I started my talk by stressing the idea that ethics arguably is the keystone of civilization, that there's something about the ethical outlook, the distinction between what's right and wrong, what's good and evil, just and unjust, that is indispensable to civilization as we think of it. To make it a little more concrete than that, I've been thinking a lot of late about the biblical commandment against murder, which I would argue is the most fundamental keystone element of ethics. That if you pull that off the table and don't respect and honor that, anything is possible, and not just possible, but justifiable. So there is a sense in which ethical insights and convictions are fundamental to civilization. But it's also the case that, and the injunction against murder is a good example of this, that these basic precepts are very easily overridden. They can be subverted by human reason, arguing about what's murder and what isn't, and sweeping murder away when it's convenient to do that for some cause or policy that you want to support. So it's this fragile and yet tenacious quality about ethics that interests me in particular. And history shows that it's got both of these qualities. Historically, these traditions and teachings are there. Historically, we know that they are disrespected, overridden, trumped by all kinds of things, and yet the ethical, kind of, it's like the dandelions that grow back. It doesn't seem to be completely annihilated. Let me give you an example from some recent historical work that it's been done. There's a historian at the University of Virginia, Alon Confino is his name. He's written a book called A World Without Jews. And he makes an important argument in his book, I believe, because he says that historians have not given enough emphasis to something that happened throughout Germany in early November of 1938, when there was a massive pogrom launched and supported by Nazi leaders that destroyed German businesses and set fire to synagogues and this is the point that Confino emphasizes, torched and destroyed Torah scrolls. And what Confino wants to argue is that the destruction of the Hebrew scripture, which is the key source for much of Western civilization for the injunction against murder, that the destruction of that scripture was emblematic of something. So he makes this argument in a way that he didn't develop in quite the way I think of it, but what it leads me to think about is the importance of finding a way to recover the precepts that are contained particularly in the injunction against murder.
I had a question about about murder.
Yeah.
Is it your contention then that there is an understanding in other cultures and other religious beliefs systems that murder is wrong? Because you could say that World War II wasn't just the Holocaust, but it was also many more millions of people that were killed by the Japanese in the process. Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge was another example of that kind of thing. Is that, were they not controlled or influenced by their religious beliefs when they were doing that?
I think that at least in our lifetimes, you wouldn't find very many people who would say that murder is good. What you would find that you'd have to deal with is what constitutes murder. And this gets thorny when we're not just talking about, homicide, but where we're talking about what today we would refer to as crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, the kinds of things that are going on in our world tonight And here there's a gray zone, you know, to use Primo Levi's term, that exists because human beings are masterful at defining and interpreting concepts to suit their interests. So I'm sure, speaking for myself here, that there are instances of things happening tonight that I would regard as murder, where some other people would say, oh no, John, that's not murder. We know about this fairly recently with regard to the idea of torture, don't we? I mean, we even have that dilemma right in our backyard in the United States. No, we weren't torturing. We were doing something else. So some of what ethics involves is the courage to, as the phrase sometimes goes, to name and shame. It requires the courage of speaking and saying, no, that is torture, that is murder. And being prepared to defend that, even though you know that there won't be universal agreement based on some, you know, innate sense of conscience or rationality that's in play. So ethics is a struggle. I mean, it's a battle for the integrity and meaning of terms to some extent. And that's its power, you know, it's fragile. But when I said, you know, I don't think there are too many people who will say murder is good. They may still play kind of fast and loose with whether this is a case of murder or that is, but you know, the basic idea has some integrity that it's hard to play totally fast and loose with it. You all have great questions and comments, by the way. I'm just
this is just a short comment, but while we're talking about the failure of ethics, I'm reminded of that village in France, Chambon-sur-Lignon,
Yep.
where the ministers, Protestant ministers, led the villagers in a campaign to conceal and protect Jewish children. And so that's the other side. Ethics doesn't always fail.
Yes, that's essential. And part of the response that's needed when ethics does fail is to decide who it is you want to stand with. Levy, I think this is partly why he so admired Lorenzo, his friend. You know, it wasn't just that Lorenzo had helped to save his life, but it was what Lorenzo embodied. And Levy's point about, you know, we're in this world to do good is not so much a proposition to which you say, oh, that's true or that's false. It's more a kind of appeal on Levy's part to say, wouldn't you like to stand with Lorenzo? Wouldn't you rather be Lorenzo than Heinrich Himmler? Wouldn't you rather be a rescuer than a perpetrator? Now, you know, it's a real question because some people will say, no, I'd rather be a perpetrator. That's safer. That's got more in it for me. But the ethical would say, no, be like Lorenzo. We'll get to your comment.
My name is Bob Keller. If you haven't done so yet, it would be very good if you could meet the director of the Watkins Symphony where you're here. His name is Yaniv Attar. He's an Israeli. And something that he has studied is what he calls composers of the Holocaust.
Yes.
And people using music, the prisoners or the inmates in the Holocaust, as a way of expressing what they couldn't do in words. And I think part of the message of that is that in trying to understand the things we're working and struggling with tonight is language has limits as far as it can only take you so far. And he would argue, and I would tend to agree, that in some ways music or some certain music can take us further than human language can. Anyway, he lives here in Bellingham, and I think you'd find it very invigorating to talk to him. I assume he's not here tonight. I can't see who's in back of me, but
Yeah, that's a good point. This person down here has been very patient.
Given the ambiguity of the definitions of unethical behavior that you just discussed, how do ethics stand in the face of moral relativism?
I tried to touch a little bit on that in the part of my talk where I was referencing Michael Berenbaum's idea about what he calls the negative absoluteness of the Holocaust. I think that I'll say two things about moral relativism, which, as I understand it, would be that there really isn't such a thing as moral or ethical truth. There are different views that people have, and these views are the results of cultural influences, upbringings, traditions that we're part of, and they can vary quite a bit, and there's no way to kind of get to a common universal ground with respect to them. There are two things about that, I think, that strike me. One is, I know very few people who live as relativists. Most of us, when you scratch the surface of intellectualism, have very strong convictions, in fact, about when something is right and something isn't. Now, it doesn't mean that just because the conviction is strong that it's true, but the first lie about relativism is that anybody really lives that way. Secondly, I think that when we're looking at what in general are referred to in international law as mass atrocity crimes, there may still not be universal agreement, but there's an overwhelming preponderance of agreement that the things that are identified under those concepts, things like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, that these are wrong. Now, the relativism thing is not completely off the table at that point, because a problem will arise that will be in this area. On what basis are you saying that these things are wrong? Is it because it's self-evident that they are, that it's just crystal clear to everybody? Well, if it were, then we're back in the dilemma of, how come people commit genocide? If everybody really knows it's wrong, why do we have so much of it? So the tricky part then becomes, if you're inclined to analyze this, how do you justify, how do you ground the claim that you're making when you say, ethnic cleansing is wrong? That's where there can be, some interesting but not insurmountable difficulties. Because some people might want to say, well, I do that because of my religious tradition. Others might say, I'm not religious. I don't believe anything about religion, but I think ethically it's wrong. So then it becomes interesting to ask, what basis do we have? And this dilemma is reflected, interestingly enough, in many of the United Nations documents that nearly all come with some reference back to World War II and to the atrocities that were committed during that conflict, that have to do with the attempt to reinstate respect for human rights. if you read many of these documents, they all have a preamble, which is where the kind of philosophical contextualization takes place. And typically these preambles to the UN documents about human rights, or if it's the one about the Convention Against Torture or Genocide, they will say two sorts of things. One part of the preamble will hearken back to past traditions that will say, it has been understood in various ways traditionally that certain things are wrong. And then there'll be another part of the preamble that will say, we have experienced things that we just can't let continue in a culture of impunity. We have to prevent them. We have to have provisions for intervening when they're planned or when they're underway. Now these two things are, these two strands, the appeal to tradition and the appeal to, the horror of circumstance in the present, they don't easily fit together intellectually if you look at it. But those are the basis for these appeals about human rights, generally speaking, insofar as the UN, reasoning about them is concerned. So this is where the so-called Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the United Nations passed in 1948 is, in a sense, universal in its aspirations, but it can't quite be claimed to be universal in its formation or in the appeals that are made to how these ideas are, grounded or rooted. That's a little more tenuous.
I want to thank Professor Roth again for a wonderful talk.